It's the NFL Showdown live before lock on Awesemo.com. Greg Ehrenberg here, joined by Kyle Dvorchak. And we've got a pretty sweet game tonight. It's sponsored by No House Advantage tonight. So we've got Cardinals and the Seahawks playing. It's a game that was flexed into the Sunday night. It's also on the main slate for both FanDuel and DraftKings. So the reason that that's a little important is because we're going to possibly want to do some late swaps there. That's something to be aware of. If you have any lineups that are dead, or maybe if you're trying to gain leverage on the field in some way to revive a lineup, or maybe you're trying to jump ahead in a GPP in some way, I'd definitely be looking to swap out maybe to some of the less popular players if you have dead lineups or something like that. So just something to keep in mind of. We don't usually have this situation, something that we used to have all the time. So, Kyle, how do you feel about this game tonight? Who do you think wins, and what kind of a game script do you think we're looking at?
Yeah, so I'm not going to deviate too much from Vegas. I'm going to say that the Seahawks win. The Seahawks, I love Kyler Murray. I promise. I love Kyler Murray. He's looked shaky. Like, he got by in a game that I'm not going to say they didn't deserve to win, because Dallas is downright awful, but they maybe didn't deserve to win in such brutal fashion last week. He threw pretty horribly. He basically gets there on one long throw to Christian Kirk, and had Ezekiel Elliott not fumbled twice, maybe we're talking about how was that game that close? Washington railed Dallas, and Arizona played it kind of close that game. But I think a few things broke their way in a sense, and they ended up routing Dallas. I'm not sure that they're as good as maybe the public thinks. So if I have to take a lean, if you made me just pick the spread, I would take Seattle here. Russell Wilson has just been cooking too hot not to go with Russell Wilson. And I do think that we see a modest, continuous lead from the Seahawks. I don't think they blow out, Arizona, because I do like Kyler Murray, and I think his legs always keep on any play, keep Arizona in the game. But I do think probably from start to finish, we see a modest Seattle lead.
And then also we've got something to talk about here. We have a giveaway. If you follow Awesemo_com on Twitter and Awesemo NFL on Twitter, like and reply to the pin tweet and say whether you think that Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson have more passing yards. One winner will be selected to receive an Awesemo Plus NFL yearly package. So with that in mind, and you guys could answer this in the chat too, who do you think has more passing yards tonight, Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson?
Oh, it's Russell Wilson. I mean, it's especially because we have seen so much of Kyler Murray on the ground that he doesn't necessarily need to have a good night as a passer for the team to even be successful. And the same, you could even argue Kenny Drake that way. So in a sense, I do think that the rushing attack, both from Drake and from Kyler Murray, does take away from Kyler Murray's passing upside. I don't think that he doesn't have a passing upside, but it's just not that necessarily he needs to go for 350 to win a game. Whereas if the Seattle defense gives up a ton of points, the only way they hang in is for Russell Wilson to go for 300 plus. So I'll lean Russell Wilson here pretty confidently.
I'll say one thing. I'm going to bring up the replies right now. Is what if just everybody's, because I do think Kyler Murray's Russell Wilson's the pretty obvious answer. I do wonder if I look at this, is just everybody answering Russell Wilson, because then you have to consider, what are the odds if you're really trying to play this like a GPP, right? In real DFS mindset. If it's, 80% of people saying Russell Wilson, then maybe give yourself a better chance just by saying Kyler Murray. But with that said, it looks like it's pretty split 50-50 looking at the replies. So whoever you think is going to have more passing yards, give yourself a chance to get an Awesemo yearly pass if you get that right. And then don't forget to like the tweet and reply with your answer. The other thing to talk about here, injury report, nothing too significant. DeAndre Hopkins is listed as questionable. He's going to play. I don't really take that too seriously. I don't know how you feel about that at this point, but he was listed as questionable last week also, looked fine on the field. This kind of feels like a situation you just have a veteran player. We've seen this a lot, especially because the new NFL injury report rules, where there's no more probable, there's no more doubtful. So there's just guys like Julian Edelman's been listed as questionable every game for 3.5 years or something like that. And I kind of feel that's what the Cardinals are going to be doing with DeAndre Hopkins. I'm not too concerned about the ankle. Do you feel any differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same way. That we saw the exact same thing last week where it almost felt like people made a bigger deal out of it than it was, because we had Schefter tweeting yeah, he's likely to play and stuff. Usually when a guy is so likely to play, you don't get big names tweeting about it, Rap Sheet or Schefter. So maybe I think we've made a bigger deal out of it because he doesn't seem to be hampered at any point. I know he didn't have a great game last week, but he was still out there getting targeted. And that's really what I care about. He wasn't being used as a decoy. They were looking at him. They looked at him 8 times. I believe that led the team by a pretty significant margin. So not really concerned about his health at this point right now. And like you said, like he's a veteran at this point, and I get he's in a new system, but we saw early in the season, like the system change has not affected him in any way whatsoever. So it's not like he needs the extra practice reps. He's DeAndre freaking Hopkins. So if you can rest DeAndre Hopkins and get him from, 90% healthy to 95% healthy, I think you are absolutely doing that. And it's probably why we see like the injury concern, but I'm not concerned.
Yeah, and then just because some people are bringing it up in the Slack chat, and if you guys are listening, have any questions, at me in the premium Slack chat for Awesemo. Some people were asking about DeAndre Hopkins. So yes, confirmed that he is active tonight, not just a rumor from Schefter. He's actually active. The other thing also, Carlos Hyde hasn't played since week 3. He's going to be active tonight. In general, I wouldn't necessarily have a whole lot of interest in him, but we're really hurting for value on this slate. There are a lot of really high-end guys to pay up for, and I look at some of those cheap guys, and I'm not sure how many of them are going to get action. And I mean, if you look at the role that Carlos Hyde played at the beginning of the season, scoring like 4 or 5 fantasy points per game, that could be valuable on a slate like this. So what kind of impact do you think Carlos Hyde will have, and how will that take away from the other Seahawks running backs?
Yeah, I think he was seeing somewhere around 4 to 5 carries per game in 3 games played and like 1 target. I know he did steal some red zone work in the first game versus Atlanta, probably because that game was a blowout, but who knows? Maybe that's a reason you get him in. And yeah, we have like no value plays on this slate. Like Andy Isabella is priced up to $3K. It's freaking Andy Isabella. He didn't catch either of his 2 targets last week. And then you get guys like, Travis Homer, Freddy Swain, who are all like, basically, they look like they have decent projections, like in terms of you look at they're averaging 4 or 5 points a game on Showdown. That's not bad. For a lot of these guys, it's because they caught the 1 touchdown that Russell Wilson threw to them on the year, and they've been like blanked or 1 targeted in every other game. So yeah, the value on this slate is pretty grim. And I actually, because of that, I'm probably going to be over the field on Carlos Hyde.
Yeah, there's somebody else just asked in the Slack chat, what do we feel about Will Dissly? People are asking about Dan Arnold. I mean, this is slim pickings at value. So I understand why people are going there, and definitely we'll be getting to some of those questions as we go along. I'll be keeping an eye on the Slack chat to see what some people say. Here somebody says, I don't care that Carlos Hyde is active. He's going to show up in the booth coaching or show up late to the game. Yeah, I wouldn't be that concerned about that. There's some sort of weird disciplinary action against Carlos Hyde. I think that he's good to go. Anybody else with questions, just fire them in as we go along, because we've got some time to kill. So we're going to be able to get to plenty of questions. Something else to note, we've got another promo going on for Awesemo. You can get an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for only $10.31 when you use the promo code PUMPKIN at checkout. That's nearly $20 off the original price. This package includes full access to all Awesemo Plus features, including player projections, ownership projections, our premium Slack channel, lineup builder, and much more. The offer is valid through Halloween, which is October 31st, which also, if you guys could figure out, $10.31, 10/31 Halloween, it all comes together. That's how it works. All right, so let's start with the Cardinals side of the game. We've talked a little bit about Kyler Murray versus Russell Wilson, so let's start right up the top. Kyler Murray is very pricey on both FanDuel and DraftKings. How much of a must-play do you consider Kyler Murray to be in this contest?
So I think you could argue that neither quarterback is a must-play because you want to have both quarterbacks, or in the sense if you want to have a quarterback. Do I have a strong preference as to whether you play Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson? Not really. Our projections have Kyler Murray as a slight value. It's fractions of a point in terms of which one is the better play. I don't think either quarterback is a must play because I think you should just be focusing on getting a quarterback in. I've looked at building lineups with double quarterbacks. It's not impossible, but it really does kill what else you can do with the rest of your lineup. I still think potentially in cash, maybe that's the way you go. But I do think if we get particularly a game where it is spread out, like if Greg Olsen and David Moore get involved or something, or if, on the other side, it all goes to one guy, those are scenarios where low to mid-price guys pop off. And then if DeAndre Hopkins is the only viable player on Arizona, like no one else does anything, which DeAndre Hopkins can have that effect. There are a lot of scenarios where that happens, where because of that, there are a lot of guys in the mid-range that are good, and DeAndre Hopkins is better than Kyler Murray, and that is the only tiebreaker. I see less of that effect with Russell Wilson, but because of Kyler Murray's rushing, I still think he's probably the best points per dollar play of either quarterback, and probably of the more expensive guys in general. So I don't think you have to specifically jam in Kyler Murray. I do think you have to jam in a quarterback, though, which would be like the caveat.
Yeah, so I think if you're going to play both quarterbacks, you have to go probably with somebody really cheap at captain, which is viable. You just have to hit on a touchdown probably. So like if you go something crazy like we talked about Carlos Hyde for a second there. You go with Carlos Hyde, a captain, you hope that he scores a 3-yard touchdown or something like that, and that's where the lineup ends up being okay. I kind of have a gut feeling that's what the winning lineup is going to be on this slate, is somebody's going to have like Will Dissly or Andy Isabella or one of those guys in the captain spot, and they're going to have like a 20-yard touchdown at some point in the game. And there's just going to be so many of the high-end guys that go off, like Russell Wilson, Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins. That's kind of what I feel the winning lineup's going to be, so that's what I'm looking to do. That's the reason that I'm not really focusing on playing one of the quarterbacks in the captain spot. I do think that ideally you want to have both of them in just because they're both high upside quarterbacks, both have rushing upside. And I think there's a pretty good chance both of them score over 20 fantasy points. And if that's the case, it's hard to imagine that they don't end up on the optimal lineup. So that's what I think is overall the best roster construction, is going really cheap at captain and just hope you hit on something. But it's definitely a very difficult slate to find value on.
Yeah, it's just, I kind of agree with that approach, though, that both of these guys have such immense upside that the odds of them, like I can pull it up. So right now we have the odds of them being the 2 through 6 best player as Russell Wilson 70% and Kyler Murray 69%. Like these are clearly the best plays. And the only reason those numbers aren't higher is because a lot of their equity ends up going into being the best overall play. Like the odds of these guys just being in the optimal lineup in one way or the other is like, it's insane. It's like 90+% for both of these guys. So I do think you want to focus on potentially, especially in tournaments, I think it could be unique to get some of these mid to low price guys. And like you said, I think even like Christian Kirk fits the bill, Andy Isabella on a deeper extent, even like Kenyon Drake, Tyler Lockett probably starts getting up to the point where it's still difficult to make great lineups, but you can do it. And maybe the only caution would be potentially, if you can, like leave a little salary on the table, or don't go straight to the easy plays. Like, I don't know, we don't have a ton of great plays. I do think Carlos Hyde will probably end up being the most popular of the punt plays, potentially Freddy Swain, just because he has like a good like DraftKings points like average. So maybe go a little off the board with your punt plays, because I think a lot of people are going to focus on getting the quarterbacks in, and they do that by like building similar lineups. So I would just focus on, where are you playing? If you're playing in a 1,000-man tournament, yeah, you're probably just doing close to playing the best plays. Not entirely, still make some pivots, but if you're playing in the largest tournaments on DraftKings, you really do have to get weird, or else you will be chopping no matter what.
Yeah, you know how I know it's close is because people are confidently saying Kyler Murray is the play, Russell Wilson is the play, but it's also split down the middle, which is always, there's always this weird thing where when something's really dicey, people get more convicted about which one they like. And you see that all the time where people will be really confident in like, oh, it's definitely this guy, it's definitely this guy. I'm going to be honest, I don't have a real lean between Kyler Murray and Russell Wilson. I think that's fine. They're both good plays. If you play multiple lineups, get exposure to both. I think that I think it's a very risky proposition to just be overly confident that Russell Wilson and or Kyler Murray is just going to be the guy today. So I wouldn't necessarily favor one over the other immensely if you play multiple lineups. I'd go split exposure between the two. Something that I saw somebody ask earlier was about Dan Arnold. And here's my take on Dan Arnold. He's losing snaps pretty much every single week to Darrell Daniels. And you look at Dan Arnold, he's 1,000. Daniels is 2,400. If you really need the 1,400 savings, then sure, I guess you go to Arnold. I prefer Daniels personally. It's not like either of them are super high upside guys, but I think that Daniels is the preferred option of the two tight ends just because of the amount of snaps that Daniels is playing over Arnold. And Arnold played, I think it was 23 snaps last week. It's just not quite enough. And that it's not like he's some guy who's scoring some ridiculous amount of fantasy points per route run. Do you have any crazy lean on Daniels versus Dan Arnold?
No, I agree. I think because we've seen more of Darrell Daniels recently, he'd probably be the play, and it's not like a crazy gulf of salary between the two. And yeah, every single week we see, like we're seeing Dan Arnold just get phased out of the system, which is a little weird. I actually thought he could have a consistent role, but that just does not appear to be the case. I don't even think he was targeted last week, or if he was, I don't think he brought down a catch. So he probably just seems to be on the outs in Arizona. I don't love either tight end, but they are cheap, and Darrell Daniels is getting a certain amount of work, and potentially we could see that continue to progress as the season goes on. If that happens this week, where he continues to eat into Dan Arnold's workload, his price actually might end up looking like a value in hindsight. I still think in his price range, there are simply better plays like Carlos Hyde, arguably like Will Dissly, and even cheaper Freddy Swain. But I don't think he's a terrible play, and he certainly will be unpopular because he doesn't no one's ever heard of this guy. He doesn't even have in this season a history of production. It's very recent, so I don't think he'll be very popular. He does have a chance at catching a touchdown if he's going to be on the field that often. He's cheap and he helps you fit in good players. So I don't mind playing some bad players if they help me fit in good players, and they have a chance at touchdowns as well. That's kind of the difference maker. Is that I do think if you're on the field fairly often with Kyler Murray, you could score a touchdown.
So I just looked it up. Dan Arnold has gone back-to-back weeks without being targeted, and his snap share has gone down each of the last 4 weeks. So with that in mind, it's just hard for me to envision him being much of a play, even at such a cheap price. I mean, what you're really relying on is him catching like a 4-yard touchdown pass or something like that. Not likely. Certainly not likely. I mean, I was going to say non-possible, but not likely enough for me to want to roster him. Dave in the Slack chat has asked, do I have a take on Trent Sherfield? Yeah, don't play him. I guess would be my take. I mean, Sherfield is one target the entire season. He's one catch for 6 yards. I mean, maybe this is a really weird slate where we're so desperate for value where a bunch of the studs go off and there's a 200 price player who scores 0 fantasy points and ends up in the optimal lineup. But no, I can't really go there. I mean, all these guys like Keyshawn Johnson, Trent Sherfield, there were guys who at times played expanded roles last year. They have DeAndre Hopkins now. So with Hopkins, Larry Fitzgerald, Christian Kirk, who was in and out of the lineup at times last year, there's a lot of options there. So that's where we're just not seeing these cheaper Cardinals guys who were at times decent last year. They're not playing enough for them to produce any fantasy value or really for me to realistically think they do well. Do you feel any differently about Trent Sherfield? I have a feeling you don't.
Yeah, I guess maybe the question was asked because Keyshawn Johnson is inactive, but like we're not seeing a ton of Keyshawn Johnson either. And because we've seen more of Andy Isabella, I do think Keyshawn Johnson's role, which is now just Trent Sherfield's role, was going to be continued to be minimized and minimized and minimized. I don't think it's impossible, but there are better plays for cheaper. I think it's more likely than not. Most times we see this game played out, Trent Sherfield doesn't even take the field, or if he does, it's not on a play that he's even the first, second, or third read. So it's likely that he scores 0 points. Maybe he takes on the Keyshawn Johnson role, and that's enough to get him 1 or 2 long catches. And those are typically deep targets when they go to Johnson or Isabella. But I do think it's just going to continue to be Andy Isabella as the number 3. I mean, I can't get that deep to go to the number 5 receiver, and it's a clear number 5 at this point. So I don't think you need to go that deep.
So we got some people who are asking about DeAndre Hopkins. That's actually a good transition to the next place to talk about anyway, because he is the next highest priced player on the slate after the quarterbacks. For me personally, generally I would really like DeAndre Hopkins, but it's the opportunity cost is the issue I have tonight. So if you're playing DeAndre Hopkins, it means that you're probably not rostering Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson because it's not really viable to fit all 3 of them in a lineup together. If you are playing Hopkins, it makes most sense to have him paired in a lineup with Kyler Murray, and then maybe you run it back with Chris Carson or something like that, because that's kind of a game script that makes sense to me. In general, though, I don't think this is the best spot to play DeAndre Hopkins just because I'd rather pay up for Russell Wilson or Kyler Murray. I definitely say if you're playing one single entry, I'd go to the quarterbacks over DeAndre Hopkins. How much different do you think the upside and maybe even the floor is for DeAndre Hopkins versus Wilson and Kyler Murray?
Yeah, I mean, the upside could parallel these guys, but the problem is, one, Russell Wilson has a ton of touchdown potential, and Kyler Murray realistically could hit the 100-yard bonus on the ground, and he's averaging 1 touchdown a game. If DeAndre Hopkins was even somewhere around 9.5, or the quarterbacks were a little more expensive, I would definitely say you can consider it, but it's exactly what you said. It's the opportunity cost. For $1,200 more, you should scrape up the $1,200 more and play Kyler Murray. $2,000 more, maybe you could make that argument, but I think I would even rather go down to a Tyler Lockett or one of the running backs, because I think, like we talked about, the winning strategy is probably getting the quarterbacks in and then punting, or not punting, but just playing cheaper at captain. DeAndre Hopkins doesn't actually get you very much cheaper at captain. All he does is rule you out from playing the quarterbacks, essentially. So I completely agree that on a different slate where essentially if they're playing almost any other team, there are probably 25 teams in the NFL that they could be playing, that I would say, yeah, I'm probably considering playing DeAndre Hopkins, stacking with Murray and ignoring the other quarterback. This is simply not one of those games.
So we move down. Some of the other wide receivers consider here. Christian Kirk, 6,400, obviously has upside because we saw him put up a monster game last week. And we saw it from last year too, where there was weird games would be Christian Kirk gets 2 catches for 20 yards, 3 catches for 30 yards. And then all of a sudden, 8 catches for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns, which if I remember correctly, was an actual stat line that Christian Kirk had, maybe even in between catchless games or something like that. So there's always upside in Christian Kirk, extreme boom bust option. he's actually somebody, if you want to go really contrarian with a captain play, there's upside there that I would consider rostering Kirk at captain. So Kirk, Fitzgerald, how do you feel about these guys? The middle tier of the Cardinals receiving core.
Yeah, the middle tier, yeah. It was, I don't know if it's exactly 150, but it was the triple touchdown, like 8, and it was around 150. And it was almost positively after a few like quiet games, because he was a guy who kept popping in like targets and air yards, and people just kept playing him. And that's kind of one of the like the canary in the coal mines of people being too sharp. It was that like the Will Fuller week, where after multiple weeks of doing nothing, everyone's like, we don't care, he's getting volume. That's how you know the field is getting sharper. Christian Kirk, I think he's a fine play. I do think our projections have him as not popular captain, but more popular than maybe his odds of hitting should be. And what he did last week, he scored 2 touchdowns, but he did so on 3 targets. He's still so far behind DeAndre Hopkins because of Hopkins' target share as just being a black hole of targets. Christian Kirk is not looking great on any given week to get a ton of catches. You simply need him to be spiky efficient. And could that happen again this week? It could. I'm not sure that it does, though, and I'm not sure that the targets warrant you chasing that spiky efficiency. Larry Fitzgerald is fine, I guess. He's so old and bad. His yards per target is like a career low, and he doesn't do anything. But like we said that, or at least I definitely would have said that about Greg Ward on the Thursday night slate, and with Alex Awesemo Baker himself, and he was like, well, he's just going to get a lot of targets. Everyone says that he is bad. Larry Fitzgerald probably isn't even going to get a lot of targets, but I do think everyone can kind of agree that he's old and dusty. Does that lower his ownership to the point where if he catches a touchdown, I'm probably profiting disproportionately? Maybe. I don't know. I don't love Larry Fitzgerald, but I do think that the public is going to tell you how bad he is. He'll be on the field for probably every snap of a game that should feature a ton of points. I don't downright hate him.
So here's why I like Larry Fitzgerald. He is not picking up all that much ownership. We have him projected under 20% right now. He's cheap, which is pretty important for this game. And even if he's not having monster upside games, like if I remember correctly, I'll bring up his game log right now. I'm not even sure that he has more than one game with double-digit fantasy points. But I don't even know if that matters on this game, because I think that, and just to harp on the same point, we need some floor from some of these cheap guys. We just need some of them to produce some fantasy points. And you look at Larry Fitzgerald, his season high is 12 fantasy points. That would be terrific for this slate, though. And if you look at his targets still, pretty consistently 4, 7, 3, 7, 5 targets. So, I still look at Larry Fitzgerald and it's like, hey, if he puts up 4 catches for 55 yards, that's probably not bad for his price in this slate. I think that a lot of people look at a player like Larry Fitzgerald and they just go, oh, Larry Fitzgerald sucks. And in a sense, that's true, except it's also because we're comparing Larry Fitzgerald to what he was at one point, which he isn't that player anymore. And so there's a lot of times we'll look at some of these showdown slates and it'll be like, oh, who's the backup tight end or the tight end who, think like the tight end who's going to get 3 or 4 targets, who's like 4,000, like, oh, is this guy a decent play? And like, oh yeah, I think he's kind of sneaky. We know that's what we're getting out of Larry Fitzgerald, but just because there's this bar that's been set for him in the past that's so high, I think that people just kind of write him off as being bad when the price makes sense at 4,600. So that's why I like him, is because this is a much cheaper price than we normally see from Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's simply that, like, I actually think he probably isn't very good, but also, like, how are you going to come into the slate and say, well, I'm just going to fill my lineup with 6 very good players? You're simply not going to do it. And like you said, if he goes out and posts 9, 10 fantasy points and he's cheap, that could very much be the key to unlocking playing Hopkins, Wilson, Murray, or Lockett, Wilson, Murray, or whatever you want. He could be the key to unlocking that. He's going to be relatively low owned, and he's going to get a decent amount of targets. Like, he has a decent floor, or decent enough, even median projection, not necessarily even floor, that if he just hits a solid outcome, he could be the key to getting better players in your lineup. And that's really all that matters, is finding the optimal roster construction. He can absolutely be a way to get there. So I think I'll probably actually, before the slate locks, probably even up my exposure to Fitzgerald more, because going to be unpopular, going to get some targets, the game features a lot of points, and he's cheap. Those are all the right pieces for a showdown slate like this.
So Andy Isabella, there's a lot of people asking about him in the chat. So here's the thing with Andy Isabella. I've been wondering for the last year and a half, why doesn't Andy Isabella play more? It seems like every time he touches the ball, something good happens, makes a lot of big plays, always has that kind of upside. So without a doubt, he has a chance to win somebody a GPP. He was out of sync on like 3 plays in the first quarter with Kyler Murray last week. And I started to think, does Andy Isabella just not know the plays that well? I was starting to think, like, is that the reason that Andy Isabella isn't getting more playing time? Because there was times where it was like, he was running a curl route and Kyler Murray was throwing it to the corner of the end zone as if he was going to run like a post or something like that. And I was just like, does Andy Isabella, is is that the issue with Andy Isabella? Is that he just doesn't know the playbook well enough to get on the field? Because there is something weird where it seems like he makes good things happen when he touches the ball, but he doesn't touch the ball enough. And at 3,000, I'm not going to rule him out and say that you shouldn't play him. But he's not necessarily a priority for me. It's really hard for me to balance the boom or bust when the bust has been so much more frequent than what the boom is. He has like 3 really good career games and everything else sucks. So there's going to be times where there's a 1-game slate and he goes off for, his 2 catches for 96 yards and 2 touchdowns. And it's like, oh, I should have played more Andy Isabella. But I feel in general, he's just going to have the 0 catches on 1 target game.
Yeah. So talking about, does he not know what's going on in the offense? Like, that is honestly not impossible, because we saw last year, the team was like completely dusted by, 3/4 of the way through the season. And they outright refused to let Andy Isabella on the field. They had nothing to lose by putting him on the field other than like a small modicum of pride if he made some dumb mistake. And they still chose not to ever play him. They're like, I think he's a 2nd-round pick. They're young, talented, or at least seemingly talented, guy they spent a high draft capital on in a season that it's not like they were competing for a playoff spot. And they just said, no, we're absolutely not going to play him. And they've lessened that approach this year. They're getting him on the field more, but it's still not a ton. And like you said, his production on a per target basis is so disproportionate to how many targets he's seen that something has to be going on there. I think he's just going to continue to operate as the number 4 on this team. And it was last week, that he had 2 targets. They were both, I think, on the first drive. One of them, he was open. Oh my God, he looks so fast. He was open. Kyler Murray just missed him. And then the other one, I do think he broke a route a different way than Kyler Murray expected. And we almost never saw from him the rest of the game. So yeah, I'm not so sure we see a ton of Andy Isabella. I think he's clearly going to operate as a number 4 receiver. He's kind of priced up for a number 4 receiver. Like, sure, he has some splash play potential, but like, is he that much different than Freddy Swain for so much cheaper? I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. If Andy Isabella was like 1,200, I think I'd feel different about him. At 3,000, I'd rather pay up the 1,600 to Larry Fitzgerald. I mean, there's so much more of a floor with Fitzgerald, who, like I said, I mean, he's getting around 5 targets per game. And Andy Isabella, it's such a boomer bust play, and the chances of his upside are just nowhere near the chance of his floor. So I don't really love Andy Isabella in this spot. There's other places I would rather go with value. So the running back situation here, I think that there is nobody who the fantasy community probably hates more than Kenyon Drake. He is a very frustrating player this year, particularly because just as everybody jumps off of him, last week Monday Night Football against the Cowboys, totally busts the slate. Breaks the 80-yard run in the final seconds of the game to flip the Millie Maker. And now we've got a situation where Kenyon Drake, 7,000, Chase Edmonds, 4,000. It's really interesting because Kenyon Drake was actually ridiculously cheap for the main slate today. And I still don't think very many people are going to roster him. But now we look at him and his price compared to Chase Edmonds. Personally, I prefer Edmonds. Last week's game aside, I kind of felt like we were tracking towards Edmonds taking over the starting running back role over Kenyon Drake for the Cardinals. I think Drake probably holds on for a little bit longer because of the big game he had. But even so, for almost half the price Chase Edmonds, he has more receiving upside. Honestly, we're really starved for value. Give me Chase Edmonds over Kenyon Drake. And because somebody asked about it before, I do think that Edmonds is a viable captain play. And he's somebody you could even stack with Kyler Murray because we've seen the passing game work from Chase Edmonds, and we've seen him score decently long passing touchdowns also. So I think there's reason to stack Kyler Murray and Chase Edmonds together. Edmonds versus Drake, where do you stand?
I'm still going to give a slight lean to Kenyon Drake because he is seeing so much volume, like you said, and it's priced correctly on this slate. It's not like the main slate where I actually think he's just too cheap relative to his volume. He's seeing over 80% of the running back carries. Chase Edmonds is exclusively a pass catcher. Now, the opposite is true of Edmonds, where he's seeing the bulk of the pass catching work, and he is not anything as a rusher. So that means Drake really only offers you anything with his legs. For that reason, I do think he offers like a modest amount of negative correlation with basically the rest of his offense, because in a game he goes off, they're probably long plays or touchdowns that he doesn't share with his team. Kyler Murray isn't passing them to him. He's simply taking away parts of drives that could be points for DeAndre Hopkins, points for Kyler Murray. So I think he makes an interesting I think you could use him specifically as a run back option. You use him as a like opposite Russell Wilson, because in an ideal world, Russell Wilson goes down, or at least if you're playing Russell Wilson takes an early deficit and then he has to play from behind. That's where we see the most cooking from Russell Wilson. I think that probably correlates well with the Kenyon Drake lineup, but I do think because I don't see that happening a ton, like in the ether, I do think I'd probably rather just like stack Kyler Murray with Chase Edmonds. I will have some builds though that are actually like, I think they'll be more contrarian and they'll have like heavy Seahawks lineups with Drake and maybe one other at most guy that aren't Kyler Murray. Those are only for big field tournaments, but I do think you gain an edge by doing that.
One thing I will say, I wouldn't play Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds together, even though they kind of play different roles in the offense. They don't necessarily share the field a ton, and there's definitely a negative correlation there. So it's hard for me to see there being a GPP winning lineup that have both the running backs. There are times we've seen it happen, except a lot of times it's because the backup running back is, $800, $1,200. It's a Wayne Gallman situation where he's ridiculously cheap. That isn't the case in this spot. We have Edmonds is 4,000 on DraftKings, and he is 9,500 on FanDuel. Those are pretty steep price tags for a backup running back on both. So I wouldn't roster them together. That is definitely one rule that I'd set in Fantasy Cruncher is to not make lineups with the two of them together. Let's see what else we have in terms of questions here. Somebody's asking about the kickers on FanDuel, if I'd rather play the kickers over Larry Fitzgerald, Jason Myers, and Zane Gonzalez. So here's the deal. They're in different price ranges. Larry Fitzgerald's only 7,000 on FanDuel. The kickers are 8,500 and 9,000. Give me Fitzgerald. I understand that he loses out on the PPR points a little bit, but honestly, where we really, really need value, I'd rather take the salary savings with Fitzgerald than pay up $1,500 or $2,000 more for a kicker.
Yeah, and these teams are, if I have the numbers correctly, 27th and 32nd in field goal attempts. That is because we've seen a more aggressive Seahawks team, and both these teams have just been scoring a lot. They've been quite efficient at producing touchdowns, so maybe you could bet on that regressing a bit, but against either of these defenses, I do think we see, and Vegas agrees, that we probably see a lot of points. So I think the field goal attempts numbers continue to hold, and neither of these teams end up kicking a ton of field goals on this slate. Of course, anything can happen, but just based on their short history of this season, these teams don't like to kick field goals. So I agree that Larry Fitzgerald, specifically for less money on FanDuel, is probably a better play.
Yeah, and then the other thing to add about kickers, too, is that while the NFL is generally a little bit behind on analytics in terms of when you go for it or what to do in certain fourth down situations, these are two of the more advanced teams, and especially we've seen them lean into more of the passing. So, with like the air raid offense that the Cardinals run, even if it's more of a, like people have been joking, horizontal raid offense than it is a vertical raid offense. But even so, they're throwing the ball a lot more. The Seahawks, with the way that they're letting Russ cook this year, they're going for it a lot more fourth downs. When teams are playing in that style, like as you mentioned to those field goal kicking statistics, teams just aren't going to be kicking as many field goals. It just makes sense when teams are going for on 4th and 1, 4th and 2, 4th and 3. It sets up less field goal kicking opportunity. So that's what I think really kills both the ceiling and floor for the kickers in this spot. No real interest in either of them, even though we really need value. I'm still not all that interested in on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I definitely wouldn't roster them because they're not even that cheap. There's guys like I said, Fitzgerald's cheaper. Greg Olson's cheaper. If you really want to take a shot on like Andy Isabella or one of the tight ends, they're all cheaper. So there's other spots I'd rather go than the kickers. Going down to the value plays, is there anybody who really stands out from the Cardinals? I know you've mentioned Freddy Swain. So how about just give me like 30 seconds. What is it that you think it makes Swain viable on this slate?
Yeah, so you would think he is essentially the number 4 receiver, and that is true to some extent, but he does largely split that role with David Moore. He's only got, I think it's like 140 to 110 receiving snaps. I guess routes run, they're both receivers. 140 to 110 or so ballpark, like routes run. He's a number 3B guy. He's incredibly cheap on DraftKings, and I want to play a lot of these guys. And because we see so many touchdowns from Russell Wilson, just being on the field as a number 3B or 4 receiver does give him a decent touchdown projection, whereas like number 4 for Andy Isabella actually doesn't take the field very often, and when he does, it's on 1 to 2 targets. So I do think that of the punt plays, Freddy Swain is probably one of the better ones, if not the best ones, depending on what you would define as your range of punt plays. Kind of falls in there with Carlos Hyde. I think I would probably take him specifically over like a Will Dissly is where I draw the line. And we do need to be looking at these plays on this slate, probably more so than any other one. So simply put, if you get on the field a lot on passing downs with Russell Wilson, I'm going to be interested.
Yeah, we've got just a lot of people asking some questions about value. Will Dissly has come up. I think I agree with you. I'd probably roster Swain before Dissly. Let me just look at the targets that Dissly's had recently. I think one of the reasons people are interested in Dissly is because they're looking at his game log and they're seeing that he scored 8.9 fantasy points in his last game. But he caught a touchdown that game, and he had one target, happened to turn it into a 19-yard touchdown. If you look at his targets for the year, 2-1, 2-2-1. So, yeah, if he catches that 10-yard touchdown pass again, he's going to be decent, except he's extremely reliant on that. If he doesn't get that one touchdown, he's not going to have a good game. I'd roster Carlos Hyde before Will Dissly. They're about the same price range on FanDuel and DraftKings. I think that there's a little bit higher of a floor on Carlos Hyde. The other thing, too, is that Carlos Hyde, I don't think, is any less likely to score a touchdown than Dissly is. I think that it's very likely that Carlos Hyde punches in a 1 or 2 yard touchdown. So those are a couple of cheap guys that I think are viable. The other thing to note also is that with Carlos Hyde back, Travis Homer, who had a couple of okay games for the Seahawks, I think he's out of consideration now. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if you're playing in the largest tournaments, you could play him just based on the fact that maybe he hangs on to the role and Carlos Hyde just doesn't come back and take it. But in anything other than trying to be the most contrarian, build a single non-duped entirely lineup, yeah, I think Carlos Hyde, the median projection has to be that he comes back and pretty much completely takes over the backup role, which potentially could have some value.
All right. Any other value plays across both teams that we haven't hit on that you want to talk about before we move over to just talking about the Seahawks?
No, like David Moore isn't in the cheapest of cheap ranges, but he's just another guy that I think these number 3 and 4 options are generally going to go potentially overlooked. Maybe we see some people gravitating towards them a bit more. I don't even think he's a great value because he's priced up, but I do think that's the problem is I think the only saving grace is that because he's priced up, I don't think very many, if any, people are going to pivot off of Christian Kirk to David Moore. And I think in a tournament sense, that's fine. If David Moore goes out and catches a long touchdown, his price won't matter. If it was 3,000 or 6,000, the difference won't matter a ton. We're looking at him. Can he beat Greg Olsen? Can he beat Christian Kirk? He's not much of a cheap play per se. He's more of the mid-range play. But I do think in large field tournaments, he's going to be almost completely unowned or very unpopular for good reason, in the sense of he's not as good of a play as Christian Kirk or Greg Olsen or some of the really actual punt plays, but that makes him super unique. So I think he's worth considering in Russell Wilson stacks. I don't think in any small field tournaments or if you're playing cash, he shouldn't even sniff your lineup. So he's just too expensive for that, but he'll be unique, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we have him, let's see. We have him projected for, sub 1% ownership, but a 7% chance to be in the top 2 to 6% of lineups on DraftKings. And then on FanDuel, we have him projected for 7% ownership. I mean, I don't think he's totally not viable, but if you're just trying to build lineups points per dollar and who are the best plays that an optimizer is going to spit out, he's going to be in 0% of lineups. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's just simply not a good points per dollar play. And in large tournaments, that's fine. If you're playing in a tournament with 500,000 people, don't play him. Just don't play him.
All right. So a Cardinals related question here that we could hit on before we move over to the Seahawks side is somebody asking, would you rather roster Kirk and Fitz together or Hopkins and Arnold? For me, it's Kirk and Fitz. And the other thing too is, but who else is in that lineup, right? I mean, I assume you have to have Kyler Murray if you're playing all those receivers from the Cardinals. For me, it's Kirk and Fitz. I just don't really like Dan Arnold.
Yeah, I think you're probably locking in a 0 with Dan Arnold at this point, and I don't think I don't know. Maybe this slate is so good that you're able to lock in a 0 because it gets all the good guys. I don't think that's the case, so I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing I said before when we talked about Trent Sherfield is, maybe if there's a spot where Wilson and Murray both go off, maybe Hopkins is a big game, Tyler Lockett is a big game. It's you need all these guys to be optimal. Then yeah, maybe there's a $200 guy who scores 0 fantasy points that somehow ends up in the first place lineup. I mean, if you really want to roster Dan Arnold, you might as well just go to one of the $200 guys anyway, because Dan Arnold is 1,000, except he might as well be one of the 200 price guys because he does not do anything. So guys, don't forget today's show is sponsored by No House Advantage. No House Advantage taking a different spin on daily fantasy sports by offering player prop contests across NBA, MLB, NFL, and PGA for cash prizes. This is a little bit different than just the regular DFS site. This is player prop contest peer to peer. So instead of playing against the house or playing in a tournament against a whole ton of people, you're playing against somebody else and you're making lineups based on player props. So instead of players being priced, a dollar amount, you're going to make a lineup based on a bunch of player props. You label them with the number of confidence that you have in them, and then you get points based on the the number you assign them to, and then whether that prop hits or not. I just did an absolutely terrible job of explaining that, except my page closed as I was reading the thing. So had to go a little off the rails there while I was reading the promo because my page closed, and now it's up. All right. So the best part is you could join today for free. Just download the No House Advantage app and check out the daily prop contest without having to deposit a dime. And when you are ready to make your first deposit, No House Advantage will match it up to $20 in free play. And when you use the promo code Awesemo, refer a friend and get $5 more after your first deposit. Beat your friends, not the house. Win big with player props today. The other thing I'll add about No House Advantage is we have projections for it on Awesemo.com. Nobody else really has projections for No House Advantage. There's also been a decent amount of overlay in the No House Advantage contest. So you get a big leg up because there's a lot of overlay in some of those contests. And then also we have projections up and nobody else really has that. So it's a good way to help build your bankroll. So let's jump into the Seahawks side of the game right here. I don't really think we need to talk too much about Russell Wilson. We've kind of hit it. He's a very good play. Kyler Murray's a very good play. I think you should have some exposure to both of them. Our projections have them very close. There's not a whole lot that differentiates them. I think if you're overly confident in one of them, it's probably a mistake because I don't think there is one reason to think that one guy is excessively better of a fantasy play than the other one. Russell Wilson probably more likely to get done with passing yards, but Kyler Murray has a ton of rushing upside. We've seen a bunch of games from this year where even where he struggles to throw the football, we've seen him rush for 60 yards and a touchdown or something like that. So there's a lot of ceiling, a lot of floor to both the quarterbacks. If we get into the wide receivers, one thing I think that is always an interesting talking point, DK Metcalf versus Tyler Lockett. We've seen both of them have a number of big games this year. DK Metcalf is somebody who I've always thought about so far this year. If there's a point where they just start giving DK Metcalf 10, 12 targets per game, he's going to absolutely destroy. The only knock on DK Metcalf is that he doesn't always get a ton of targets. There's a lot of games where he gets, 5, 6 targets, and you're just relying on him being uber efficient to have a big game. With all that in mind, DK Metcalf versus Tyler Lockett, who do you lean towards?
Yeah, so you talked about it. If there is a world in which DK Metcalf starts getting like 10 targets a game, he will be monstrous because right now I think it is either 25 to 24% or 24 to 23%. He is barely leading the Seahawks in target share. Tyler Lockett is still almost as involved, but he has a 50% air yard share per airyards.com. He has been one of the, if not the most used players in stretching the field. And it's not like it's not like, Andy Isabella only stretches the field. DK Metcalf stretches the field on every other play because he is getting so many looks down the field. So generally, I would say I would potentially lean DK Metcalf. However, pricing is so tight that I think potentially Tyler Lockett comes in as simply a better value play. I know he doesn't have the same overall ceiling on a per target basis potentially, but we've seen so many like flip-flop back and forth games where DK Metcalf goes off, Tyler Lockett's quiet, and vice versa, that I think these two are probably potentially closer than their pricing indicates. I'll lean Tyler Lockett slightly, although I do think if you just wanted the best like overall points, you would choose DK Metcalf, but you have to account for his price, and you have to account for his price on the fact that I want to play Kyler Murray, I want to play Russell Wilson. These are expensive guys to fit in. If I'm going to do that, I think potentially the lean is Tyler Lockett.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's because of the price difference. Kind of how we feel about DeAndre Hopkins, what we said before. The opportunity cost of playing DK Metcalf is probably you can't roster one of the quarterbacks. The other thing to consider, too, is the price point of DK Metcalf, where he's $13,000 on FanDuel, and on DraftKings, he is $10,200. I'd rather go to Hopkins if you absolutely need to roster one of the receivers for that price. Hopkins is marginally more expensive than Metcalf, but still, I think that he's the better wide receiver of the two. Even if we've seen a number of big games from DK Metcalf, I'm still going to trust the volume over Hopkins versus the big play potential of DK Metcalf, because ultimately what you usually need from Metcalf is for him to have, a 70-yard touchdown pass where he doesn't toss the ball away before he reaches the end zone like he did in week 2. But DeAndre Hopkins, just the ceiling and floor is so high for him because he gets, last week notwithstanding, because the Cardinals won by 1 million points, he's getting peppered like 12, 15 targets a game. He leads the league in targets. He leads the league in receptions, leads the league in yards coming into this week. So with all that considered, I think that Hopkins is a better high-end target than DK Metcalf. And there's a really big price difference between Metcalf and Lockett. Lockett, $8,200 compared to $10,200 for Metcalf. We've seen the two of them kind of alternate big games. So I think that Lockett, for this particular slate construct, makes for the better play.
Yeah, I think you laid it out perfectly. And our top showdown and single game plays tool has a gulf between DeAndre Hopkins and DK Metcalf in terms of which one is more likely to be the top overall play of the slate. It is not even close. And then you adjust for salary and it doesn't get any better because DK Metcalf is hardly cheaper than DeAndre Hopkins. He's only 600. It's another place where we simply talk about opportunity cost. If we're looking at DK Metcalf versus DeAndre Hopkins, which one is more likely to lead the slate in scoring? DeAndre Hopkins by a wide margin. Which one is more expensive? DeAndre Hopkins by a tiny margin. So if you're paying up a receiver, I don't see why you would go to Metcalf when you have Hopkins as an available choice. And if you're paying for a Seattle receiver, am I that confident that DK Metcalf outscores Tyler Lockett? Of course not. I don't think, like with anything we've talked about it with Murray versus Wilson. You shouldn't really be that confident in very many things. We should be more confident in our ownership projections than we should be in DeAndre Hopkins versus DK Metcalf, in Murray versus Wilson. So I'm going to go with, and like our overall points per dollar projections, like the same thing can be said. We should be more confident that Tyler Lockett outscores his cheap price than we should be that DK Metcalf does the same thing at $2,000 more. So if we're ranking the receivers, I'd go Tyler Lockett, then DeAndre Hopkins, then DK Metcalf, because Lockett is the cheapest and still offers you a ton of upside. DK Metcalf is hardly discounted from Hopkins, so I'll just go with Hopkins there.
All right, only 4 minutes left until lock. If you guys have any last minute questions, get them in. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel. My favorite play on the slate, saving the best for last with a few minutes here. I really like Chris Carson this slate. I think with all of the focus on the passing games, he could go a little bit overlooked in terms of his percentage chance of being the top overall play and his percentage chance of being in the optimal lineup according to our Showdown tool. He is the guy who has the biggest gap between his odds of being on that optimal lineup and what his actual ownership is. Chris Carson, 9,000. Even though Carlos Hyde's back, I don't necessarily think that kills Chris Carson at all. I mean, because Carlos Hyde is just going to kind of slide into the homer role. It's not like all of a sudden Chris Carson, sees his snaps or his touches cut in half. Maybe he loses out on a couple of carries, but nothing significant. I think 9,000 on Chris Carson on DraftKings, and then on FanDuel, he's 13,500. I think he makes for a really good play on both sites. The other thing, too, is you can make really sensible lineup constructions where you could assume that the Seahawks are going to win. You play Chris Carson, then you run it back with some of the Cardinals passing game. So if you're going to make a lineup without Russell Wilson, I think you want to have Chris Carson in it. And that actually is a lineup that I really like a lot, a way to build lineups. I think that's a good game script to build lineups around. How do you feel about Chris Carson?
Yeah, I really like Chris Carson as well, specifically because he's getting so many looks in the passing game. He's seeing over 70% of the receiving work out of the backfield in terms of target share of the running back targets. So he is the primary pass catching back, and he's the primary running back. And I would imagine he still gets goal line carries over Carlos Hyde. So he is like the full package as far as running backs go. And with receiving running backs, you would think that has a large correlation with their quarterback. Not necessarily, because if he goes out and catches 4 balls for 25 yards, those 25 yards aren't useless for Russell Wilson, but they're a point. They are so little in terms of what they do. But 4 catches for Chris Carson is actually a lot of fantasy points. So I think that correlation is very mitigated because of how the players score. So you don't have to necessarily have a 2-touchdown, 3-touchdown game on the ground for him to be optimal captain. You can also just have a 1-score game and then have him rack up a ton of pass catches, and then he still makes sense as a bit of a negative correlation with Russell Wilson. And I completely agree. When you're looking at your lineup, you should be building it in terms of how it correlates with itself. Or the other approach you can have is just like going full D-gap and trying to build the most unique lineup. But assuming you're not talking about the largest fields, I do think you should focus primarily on how your lineup correlates within itself. Chris Carson probably gives you a good amount of contrarian build versus Russell Wilson, and then you still get to play Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins. So I completely agree. I talked about it from the Kenyon Drake perspective on the other side of the ball. I think you can make the exact same argument with Chris Carson here.
So we've hit on just about everybody. We got 2 minutes left until lock. Are there any other cheap players or somebody we haven't talked about from the Seahawks that you want to bring up? I mean, Greg Olsen, somebody we haven't hit on. Other than that, I mean, we've hit on almost every single viable player from this game.
So I think we have two more players I don't know if we talked about. I do like Greg Olsen a lot, though, because he's on the field a lot. He gets some red zone looks. It's sort of the expensive Freddy Swain or David Moore argument or whatever, although he's cheaper than David Moore. I think he's a good enough play. Defenses. Have we talked about defenses at all? I am not super huge on them, but I think anything can happen, and people see the high total and they say, I'm absolutely not going to play these defenses. They're cheap. We know that last season, Kyler Murray took a lot of sacks. He's thrown some interceptions this year. I don't hate the Seahawks defense. They're only 3,600. They're not going to be very popular. I'm not going crazy with them, but I think it's worth throwing in a little bit.
All right. That's going to bring us to lock. It is about 30 seconds until the slate starts. Should be a good game. I know that a lot of us also, the main slate kind of hinges on this because I assume it's going to be massively popular. Maybe not Hopkins, though. I think that he's going to be a pretty interesting play on the main slate just because he was listed as questionable on FanDuel and DraftKings. That generally tends to discount some of the ownership. Any final thoughts before we head to lock here?
No, let's get some of these weird, cheap punt plays. Let's get some Freddy Swain. I don't know. Not as much Dan Arnold. Nah, not Dan Arnold. Carlos Hyde and some of this running back stuff because I think that's what you and I were kind of centering on this week is building around that.
Yeah, I'm really excited for a 1-yard touchdown and like the end of the fourth quarter in garbage time to sway the entire slate because that generally seems to be what all these showdown slates come to. So with that said, that will wrap up the show today. On the way out, guys, please do us a favor. Like the video, subscribe to the podcast network, subscribe to the YouTube channel. That helps us out a lot. And that'll do it for us.